Design problem 2 this week is continuing to work in InDesign and another grid project. I'd like you to follow the examples in Project Modular Grid from Ellen Lepton's book. But first, before I come to that page, let's go through the assignment. Again, it's an InDesign assignment. Your goals to create a modular grid using guides and rulers. Use the grid to arrange the text blocks listed below using the principles of hierarchy. So you're going to use all of this text in the grid. Use proximity to create unity between the headings and the descriptions. So each one of these descriptions has a heading. We want to use proximity, so in other words, I don't want to have the heading all the way over here and the description over here because I'll never understand that those two go together. So it's going to be a modular grid. We're going to be very expressive with this grid, but we still need to use proximity to be able to understand what goes with what. Be consistent in your design. So for example, if you start to have some of them vertical,
I also want to point out that just like I had mentioned at the last tutorials in Illustrator, I am working in the Essentials Classic view, and that's why you see all of my properties up here in what's called the options bar. So if you want to have those options for your stroke and your stroke weight and fill up in here, you're going to be in the Essentials Classic. If you want to have them in the Properties panel, you'll have them in the Essentials, and that's all the same information, it's just over here. So I'm going to switch it back over to Essential Classic.
Here. You have some examples here of taking the text, and these first examples, they really don't use all of the methods of hierarchy, right? They use proximity and mostly working with a grid. I want you to use more methods of hierarchy. So we can see the heading, the description. So this one doesn't have very good proximity. These all have good proximity. But you can see how they're spanning multiple columns. They're not necessarily keeping everything within the grid, within these particular columns that they're created. So you're going to do 6 different variations. So try different things. So in this one, for example, they are using the columns for the specific types. And for the major description, this is common typographical disorders. And that description, they're spanning 2 of the columns. Same thing here. They're spanning 2 of the columns. Spanning 2 of the columns. So they're coming up with different variations. Here's an example where they're starting to make some of the text vertical, but still keeping the headings horizontal. Here it's flipped, but it's consistent. So these these descriptions are always vertical. Over in this one, these headings are always the ones that are vertical. So going back over to the specific assignment, so you can use those as a reference and read the information on modular grid. And let's just finish with my project requirements. So you're going to create 6 of them. In the first one, use one size of the font and flush left alignment only. So you're going to use the spatial arrangement to construct the hierarchy. And then in 2 to 4, start adding more methods of hierarchy such as font size, weight, different font families, things like that. And 5 and 6, I want you to get really experimental. This is what it starts out as, like this, but I want you to get much more experimental than this. You could add some more color. You could make the whole background black. You could start trying to work on a diagonal. You could make playing with figure ground. Maybe some of these have black space in the background and the text is white and it kind of becomes checkerboard. See how far you could push it. See maybe overlapping. Anything. So the last 2, completely remove yourself from everything else you've been doing and jump into it and try to really push what you could do with this grid. So notice each one of these of the grid, they all have their own gutters. So let's talk about setting that up in InDesign. I have my page already set up here. I'll start you from the beginning. So from File, New, go into Document, and I'm going to call this my Design Grid 2, and I'll switch it over to inches. 6 pages, and I do want them to be facing pages. So 6 pages, each variation will have its own page. And if you want, you don't have to do this. If you want to have InDesign help you with setting up your guides, you could start off with 4 columns, and I use their default gutter space, And I have moved my margins back to 1/2 inch for this practice. That's pretty standard, 1/2 inch. Okay, and I'll hit create. And so something that's a little bit different in InDesign, if we look over here at our panels, you're used to the layers, but I also have the pages. And so this shows me which page I'm working on, and I could select the various pages. I can see all 6, starting with the first one up here, and here it illustrates my facing pages. And I can scroll down and I can see them all. And so they all have the same margins and the columns and gutters that I put in. Now each one of your 6, you don't have to use the same grid. If you look at what I have set up already over here, so in this example I have kind of more square-like grids. In this one I have my top and my bottom as smaller grids, and the middle sections are a larger grid. Let's go over how to get the text. You can copy and paste the text over from Blackboard. We want to use all of it, so I'm just going to copy it all here using the keyboard shortcut Control-C and go over to InDesign. I'll go up to this one where I don't have any text already, and I have my text tool selected, and I could either just click. This is just like we did in Illustrator. You could just click and have the text come out, or you could also draw out a text box if you want and then paste in, Control-V. And I'm just going to use this as my starting point. This one would not be acceptable, but now I could take each one of these. So I could take this, copy it, or cut it out. Actually, I'll use Control-X to cut it out, and now I could paste it up here. So I'm going to draw out my box and paste it in. So I could use this as a good starting point and then separate them all out and put them into their own individual boxes and move them around with the selection tool. So you just want to make sure that you don't get things separated out, but you can always use I could put this into the same box, but I think for the modular system I want to have my descriptions and my headings in separate boxes. And so now I have them in the bounding box, and I could just resize them. So I'm not actually resizing the font size, but I could move the modular grid system around so I could see what would this look like if my text was very long and skinny, or if it was wide and this way. So you can really take advantage of these bounding boxes to quickly adjust how the text looks in your grid. Now if you get that red plus sign there, that means that you can no longer see all of the text that's within your bounding box, and you have to expand it one way or the other until you no longer see that red. Okay, so now I'm seeing all of my text. I could rotate these just by hovering up in the corner, and you get that rounded curved double arrow. I can make that kind of adjustment. And in terms of the other adjustments, I just take my text tool and I select whatever text I want, and I can go up here to my options bar and change that font size. I could also make it a font size that's not specified here, so there are some pretty big jumps, like between 48 and 60. Well, what if I want to put in 54? So I could do that manually as well. You're not limited to just those specific sizes. Okay, so our goals, just looking back to one I've already worked with, is think about using this grid, and as I said, every grid doesn't have to be exactly the same, but every page should have a grid. So we have our 4 columns and our 4 rows, but they don't have to be exactly the same. I do want you to use gutters in between all of them. We're going to start out and use very little hierarchy, basically just using spatial unity to work with the grid, and then slowly add more methods of hierarchy such as scale and font weight. Okay, in terms of when you're finished with this, you're going to go to File, Export, and you're going to export it as a PDF. All right, let me know if you have any questions.